Hey, everybody. I have a feeling there will be some people still trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started just because we have a busy schedule here. So, welcome. My name is Marianne Iverson, and I'm the Director of Aging Support at the Down Syndrome Connection of the Bay Area. And I also have the privilege of serving as a co-chair along with Sarah Verde from Ability Path Sarah Verite is from Ability Path, and we are in a group called, it's a work group known as the Coalition for Dementia Care Services, or CDCS. It is with the work in this group that the idea of this webinar was formed. We specifically wanted a webinar geared for regional center staff and service providers to provide information about the unique aging needs of individuals with Down syndrome. That way, so they can best understand their clients' needs and subsequently the best way to serve them as well. So we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Elizabeth Head, who is a professor at the University of California at Irvine, and Dr. Lucy Ezralu, who serves as the Senior Psychologist Supervisor and Clinical Services Branch at the California Department of Developmental Services. And I will let them both explain in more details about their work in the field of IDD and dementia. But so in terms of Q&A, if you have any questions, we're going to wait until both speakers are finished. So if you'd like to go ahead and write your Q&A, your question in the Q&A section, we will try to get to those at the end of both of their presentations. So please go ahead and ask those questions. Um, and I think that's it for me. So without further delay, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you. Go ahead.
Great. I'm so excited to talk to this group of people. It's not a group that I get to interact with as much as I would love to. So thank you for joining in. And Marianne, thank you for setting this up. Really appreciate it. So I'm a basic science researcher, and for many years now, I've been working with older adults with Down syndrome, but more from a bench science approach of trying to understand Alzheimer's disease development in this vulnerable group, with the idea of finding ways to intervene and prevent Alzheimer's disease or treat or reduce the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So that's kind of my perspective on it. But I've been having a lot of fun catching up on the literature and speaking with more families and self-advocates about what they can be doing to age as healthily as possible. So what I was thinking about starting with, as soon as I get my pointer to work, is giving a little bit of background so we're all on the same page. And we'll start with just talking about what Alzheimer's disease is. And I think many of you are very familiar with this, so I apologize, but AD is the most common cause of dementia in the elderly, and it is associated with a change in learning, memory, and other functions, behavioral changes, to the extent where eventually these changes interfere with the activities of daily living. And as most of us know, the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is age. And we define Alzheimer's disease by looking at the brain after a person undergoes brain donation. And we see two kinds of pathologies in the brain, and that includes this beta amyloid protein, which the arrow is pointed to in brown. And we see inside of neurons in the brain, we see tau protein accumulating into these neurofibrillary tangles. And when you have sufficient numbers of both of these pathologies, then you fit the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And there are many causes of dementia, but Alzheimer's is the most common. Now, the good news for people with Down syndrome is that they're living longer. And back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, most people with Down syndrome didn't live much past their teens or their early 20s. And a good part of the reasoning for that is not correcting congenital heart defects, which led to mortalities, higher mortalities. But also, as many of you are experiencing now, some of the reasons why people with Down syndrome are living longer is that we're getting better medical care, we're managing co-occurring illnesses much better, and also integration into society, education, full social engagement are all the things that have come together so that now we're seeing people with Down syndrome living into their 60s and 70s. And indeed, some of our research studies that follow people longitudinally as they age with Down syndrome, we have several people in their 70s who are enrolled in our research. So that is wonderful, wonderful news. But as with everybody, of course, the older people with Down syndrome are getting, age is again a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And so it's really impacting this cohort of people each decade more and more. But in addition to the age impact on risk of Alzheimer's disease, for people with Down syndrome in particular, because of the genetics, they're at even higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So here's an example of a karyotype from a person with Down syndrome, and the arrow is pointing to the extra copy of chromosome 21, which thankfully is the smallest chromosome, so a much more limited number of genes are being overexpressed. But there's some critical genes on chromosome 21 that are associated with Alzheimer's disease, and that puts them at enhanced risk. So when you think about this a little bit more, people with Down syndrome, having Down syndrome, that is the greatest cause of genetic Alzheimer's disease in the world. It's not the familial Alzheimer's disease with mutations, because the number of people with that scenario is much smaller than the number of people with Down syndrome living around the world. So we do have two things going on at the same time, aging, and we have this high genetic risk. And that's primarily because of one gene on chromosome 21 called the amyloid precursor protein gene that forms those plaques I showed you in the first image. When we look at the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease changes in the brains of people with Down syndrome with age, almost everybody over the age of 40 years with Down syndrome will have the full neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease in their brains. So they'll have both plaques and tangles. And what this graph shows is when you look at age ranges of people with Down syndrome, and these are people who have, we're very grateful to them, have undergone brain donation, and you look at the prevalence or the frequency of when we see plaques and tangles for Alzheimer's disease, that's pretty low up until about 30, and then after the age of 30, the events really skyrocket for people with Down syndrome. Between 30 and 40 is a really delicate age when all these changes start to accumulate in the brain. And I'm going to tell you about, I know this sounds like really bad news, but I'm going to tell you about some really interesting good news later on, where we're learning an awful lot by very special individual people with Down syndrome. Now, even though we see all the neuropathology changes by the time a person with Down syndrome is in their 40s, we may not see any cognitive changes or any changes in behavior until almost a decade later. So what this graph is showing, it's one study from a group in the United Kingdom. And it turns out when you look at all different studies that include people with Down syndrome and watching as they age all around the world, we come up with kind of the same average number. And that is really between 50 and 56 years of age is when you will start to see potential changes related to Alzheimer's dementia in this group of people. And those changes might be very early behavioral changes, or they might be memory-based changes. But that's about the sweet spot when we see all of those things happen. So it's fascinating because in one respect, by 40, everything is happening in the brain, but it takes 10 more years for function to change. And that gives us some hints for people with Down syndrome from a research perspective that however their brains are buffering all of that pathology for 10 years is something we want to learn more about, so we can stretch that time out much longer and maybe pass that on to everybody. Another thing I'll note, and you'll see this in your own experiences, is that there's a large amount of individual variability. And in fact, there's a 30-year individual variability. So a person with Down syndrome may be in their 50s and be absolutely and completely fine. And then the next person who has Down syndrome, who's in their 50s, comes to you, they may be showing pretty significant behavioral or cognitive changes. So although age is really predictive for us in many ways, there's huge amounts of individual variability in that age of onset. And now we're seeing an increasing number of people with Down syndrome living up until their 70s, which is pretty fantastic, without showing any major signs of cognitive decline. And again, those people we're learning an awful lot from as we identify them, because we want to know how they're doing this. So what is it about them that is special, that even though they have Alzheimer's disease in their brains, they aren't showing the dementia symptoms that go along with those. And some new studies that have come out are giving us some insights into how impactful Alzheimer's disease dementia is in people with Down syndrome just along in the United States. And there's some beautiful epidemiological studies being completed by Eric Rubenstein and Brian Skocko at Boston University, where they're able to access the Medicare Medicaid data, de-identified of course, but they can extract some really, really interesting and useful information for us when we think about how are things going to look in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years and planning some of the approaches that we need to think about for taking care of these individuals as they get older. And in this study of 132,000 people in the United States with Medicare, Medicaid information, at least 23% of them were diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia. That is not a small number. And those 31,000 individuals are most likely over the age of 40, but I don't have the age breakdown as nicely. But in this graph, the probability of a person with Down syndrome being free of dementia across the age span here drops down dramatically with age. But again, another of the more optimistic note I'll point out here is there are still 15 to 20% of people in their late 70s that aren't showing signs of dementia. And we can talk about, is this a detection issue or others? And Lucy's here and she's amazing and she can talk a lot more about this. So it is a highly prevalent condition in older adults with Down syndrome, and we need to be planning for this. So that's kind of the one side of the coin, that we know an awful lot about what's happening with aging for people with Down syndrome biologically. We have a really good handle on when they might show cognitive decline or overt dementia. We recognize that every single person is different, although in groups, in aggregate, everybody kind of goes along a very similar trajectory. And all of these Alzheimer's changes we're seeing in people with Down syndrome are pretty similar to what we see in the general population, except everything is shifted to younger ages and it can happen a lot more rapidly. So those are some things to keep in mind when working with families and with self-advocates with Down syndrome. So there was a recent review paper that came out from the Lancet Commission that I took a lot of hope from. And it turned out that this review paper also came out at a time where we were seeing a couple of individuals with Down syndrome in our research studies that seemed to be escaping the dementia profile against a background of lots of Alzheimer's disease changes. And even though this article was prefaced by showing 2 new risk factors for dementia that we could potentially modify, I'm going to go through this with kind of a movie spoiler type of approach to talk about how can we reduce the risk of dementia for people with Down syndrome and also for the general population. So these are things that we can take to our families, we can remember for ourselves. And it's quite impactful because I know we think of genetics as being a big driver of Alzheimer's disease, and it is, but there's also a number of additional factors that we have control over that we might be able to reduce our risk. So this is a summary of a lot of science that's been happening over the past several decades. And I've purposely blurred this out so your eyes are okay. But I'm going to go through this as a story about all the ways we can reduce our risk factors and what percentage of risk can we reduce this by. But do this across the lifespan, because for people with Down syndrome, there's a lot of the risk factors that drive Alzheimer's disease that are present already in childhood. So it's never too soon to start. But another kind of good take-home message from this work is it's also never too late to start. And that's something I hope we can also take home. And I'm going to incorporate some of these findings from the Lancet article with what we know about Down syndrome from our basic science literature. So one of the things we can do to reduce our risk factors for Alzheimer's disease related to early life experiences, and I think most of us are familiar with this literature, is that the less education you have, the more at risk you are for Alzheimer's disease. Or flip that, the more education you have, the more protected you are from Alzheimer's disease. And so children with Down syndrome who have a much richer educational experience at young ages will probably benefit even more in the long run as they get older. Now, there isn't good scientific data for this concept in people with Down syndrome, but something that does come up and we get asked about is the role of the level of intellectual disability in a person with Down syndrome and whether that might affect their risk of Alzheimer's disease later. And we are capturing some really nice data about this in some of our work with the Alzheimer Biomarker Consortium for Down syndrome, which is an NIH funded study that we've been doing for almost 9 years now. But here's a really nice piece of work from Segan Hartley from the University of Wisconsin. And in this graph, what she has done is on the x-axis, we have the age of the individual who was in our study. And on the y-axis, we have essentially a level of intellectual disability. And this graph, you can see all the lines for people who have severe premorbid levels of IQ, or moderate or mild, that those lines overlap considerably. So the level, the baseline level of intellectual disability of a person with Down syndrome does not impact when and how they will develop Alzheimer's disease. And the rate that they will show changes will be similar across all levels of intellectual disability. So I think that is good news. That doesn't mean concerns about level of intellectual disability puts a person at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. So now we can talk about what risk factors can we reduce during midlife. And here's a whole bunch of really some co-occurring illnesses and conditions that we all have an opportunity to modify, with some exceptions. So for example, in midlife, hearing loss, having high levels of cholesterol, so controlling your cholesterol levels, managing depression, being physically inactive drives higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. The presence of diabetes that's not managed well will drive risk. Smoking, hypertension is a big risk driver for Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementias. Obesity and excessive use of alcohol are all things that drive increased risk. Now, notice I glossed over traumatic brain injury because that's something we can't necessarily control. But everything else, we have an opportunity to control those risk factors, reduce them, and combination, that will have a big impact on our risk for Alzheimer's disease. But I'll also point out that for people with Down syndrome, some of these things are really prevalent and some of these things are not. So, for example, people with Down syndrome typically don't develop hypertension. Indeed, we have the opposite concern sometimes, and that is they have hypotension. So, but you can imagine a lot of these factors really are in play for people with Down syndrome. And here's some data to support that. So again, in this study that I'm talking about, and these data have been replicated across many different studies of people with Down syndrome. But it highlights that some of these conditions that we should try to control are highly prevalent in people with Down syndrome. So for example, hypothyroidism, over half of the people with Down syndrome have hypothyroidism. We don't know yet what that risk is for Alzheimer's disease, and we hope to learn about that in the coming years. But clearly we need to manage that as a co-occurring illness. Sleep apnea, poor sleep, is a big driver for Alzheimer's disease, and I'll talk about that shortly. And we have a number of mental health conditions that would benefit from management to reduce risk for Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. So all of those risk factors can be highly prevalent in people with Down syndrome, and they could be managed. And sleep is a really interesting condition that all of us, and I'm speaking for myself and I'm sure many of us here, sleep is hard. We don't do really good at getting enough sleep or good quality sleep. And this is especially profound for people with Down syndrome, where sleep apnea is very prevalent, partly due to the structure of the neck and the tongue, and sometimes driven a lot by obesity or overweight or lack of exercise. And this is a complicated graph, but the take-home message is that the worse your sleep is, be it measured by how sleepy you are during the day, how frequent you have insomnia symptoms, how quickly you wake up or wake up during the night, all those things that break up sleep, that lead to poor sleep, drive much more cognitive changes in people with Down syndrome. And this is replicated over and over again for everybody, including people with Down syndrome. And you can also see the two colors. We have some bar graphs in blue and some in red. Some situations, women are more affected than men, and in other situations, men are more affected. And this is something we think about in all of our aging studies is aging is not biologically similar in men and women and can lead to additional risk factors that we all need to control. All right, so now if we go to late life factors, this is again where this is the good news. There are things that are happening to us in later life, again, that we can potentially modify to reduce our risk. And these include primarily social isolation, exposure to air pollution, probably cumulative across the lifespan, and visual loss is a big driver of cognitive problems, which kind of makes sense. And here's some examples of the impact of these types of factors for people with Down syndrome. When we look back at what happened during the pandemic, when everybody became super isolated, and for people with Down syndrome, there was a complete withdrawal from day programs, from working, from lots of social interaction, that isolation had a significant impact on the mood and behavior of people with Down syndrome. And we have yet to find out how this is going to impact their risk of dementia, if it's going to drive that a little bit earlier. Fingers crossed it doesn't. But clearly, social isolation has impact on behavior and cognition for people with Down syndrome. And hearing is also, visual loss is also a clear problem with older adults with Down syndrome. And this graph by Sharon Krinsky-McHale in New York, she shows that people with Down syndrome really are hypersensitive to visual loss as they get older. And of course, for an older person with Down syndrome, we're talking 50s, 60s, 70s, they're having eye changes that we might see in the general population, 70s, 80s. So making sure vision is as corrected as possible is going to help that person with Down syndrome. So they seem like rather simple things, but nonetheless, they may have a huge impact on the quality of life of that person as they get older. So now when you put this all together, we can reduce our risk for Alzheimer's disease if we manage all of these factors by 45%. And that's a big number, considering there's clearly going to be some genetic drivers of this disease, but these are things we could potentially change. And that's some messaging I think that would be really great to share amongst yourselves as people are helping to manage cases of, and working with families of people with Down syndrome, to just kind of pick off those risk factors and reduce risk for dementia and improve quality of life for everybody involved. And there's a beautiful schematic. I found this online. It was adapted from this review paper by the Alzheimer's Research UK, and we can share these slides. But I think this is a beautiful graphic that could be shared, that if we can, again, kind of manage each of these pieces, we're making our lives better. So in the last little bit, I'm going to talk about how we might be able to put some of these risk factors or controlling risk factors into practice for people with Down syndrome. And I will come at it from a 30,000-foot view, realizing there's a whole lot of logistics and practicalities that we're going to be at play here and make some of these things much more challenging than they appear just by talking about them. But managing co-occurring illnesses for those who have access to good care, as many of those co-occurring illnesses that can be managed, the better that person will be. So I'm surprised sometimes by some of our participants when we do a basic lab workup for them as part of research. We find that their hypothyroidism, for example, isn't under control as nicely as it should be. And keeping really a close eye on psychiatric conditions. And I know, and I've heard from families over and over, accessing good care for psychiatric conditions is a challenge. But if it's at all possible, trying to get depression managed. And sleep apnea is another one that is very frequent, and I hear lots of families talking about how difficult that is to control for people with Down syndrome, but there's lots more treatment options available now. And certainly a good night's sleep will have a big impact on brain function. Having a healthy diet, and again, some of this is, we kind of know this, that having a diet rich in fruits and vegetables and antioxidants are all better than taking vitamin supplements. Getting vitamins from your food is definitely the best way to go. And there's lots of elements, for example, to the Mediterranean diet, and I'm not advocating that one, although I think it's a great diet. that there's lots of fish, nuts, and healthy oils, fruits, and vegetables that, again, really provide the body with lots of nutrients. And having this type of healthy diet can reduce obesity and overweight, which drives other risk factors like diabetes, which can also drive Alzheimer's disease. I also recognize this kind of diet can be very expensive and not maybe available to everybody, but that would be the gold standard if we could get to it. Physical activity. This should be hopefully a lot more fun. That the more we can improve opportunities to engage in physical activity for people with Down syndrome, we reduce risk of obesity, cardiovascular function, and there's beautiful biological data showing that the more physically active you are, the more neurons you'll grow in your brain, and the better those neurons will be connected. So that improves cognition, and it also buffers your brain from damage if you can keep your neurons there nice and healthy. And your brain will make growth factors also to keep your neurons healthy. So we don't know yet what kinds, how much, but we do know that some is better than none. And some of these activities are really a lot more fun done in groups rather than alone. And I put Special Olympics up there. I know many of you are familiar with Special Olympics. Certainly, they're an amazing organization that would clearly be supportive of this physical activity approach for healthy brain aging. Mental activity is another activity we should be engaging in. And again, there's good biology behind this, saying that mental activity can accelerate the rate of how neurons that we grow in our brains. We do grow new neurons in our brain even into old age. And with the physical activity on top of that, we can give those neurons, new baby neurons, a chance to survive. And again, mental activity strengthens the connections between neurons in your brain, and chemicals are released when you engage in mental activity that support your neurons. And so I put some examples of a young man learning how to play the violin, which is certainly well beyond my abilities. And then we have another lovely gentleman here who's learning how to cook. So those are really fun activities, I think, that can occur in a group setting that engage a lot of these different activities, social as well as physical as well as mental. And of course, social activities are critically important for all of us as we age and for people with Down syndrome. And again, really solid biology out there showing that it's healthy for your brain. Your brain responds to social interactions in a very beneficial way. And there's some very nice data showing that people who live into very old ages, 90s and 100s, they have very active social lives and they have lots of friends. And that social network tends to protect people from Alzheimer's disease. So definitely some good science behind this as well. And we're learning more and more, and certainly in these times, when we're doing a lot of doom scrolling with social media, stress reduction can be fantastic for everybody. We know stress is bad for the brain. We release chemicals that really impair brain function. A little bit of stress is okay. It actually makes things better, but a chronic stress leads to chronic chemicals being released, and that can lead to inflammation in your brain and your body. So keeping an eye for stress reduction is also a really great way to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to give you one example of a woman with Down syndrome who kind of captures a lot of these guidelines for how to be aging more healthily. And this was a really amazing lady, and I'm sure there's a lot of data on this slide. This was an amazing lady with Down syndrome. She passed at the age of 63 years, well past the age when someone with Down syndrome would typically show signs of dementia. So she did not have dementia at 63. When we looked at her brain scans, and here's some images from PET scans showing those beta amyloid plaques I showed you in the very first image. This is a non-invasive way to see these plaques in the brain. As we followed her over time, she did have lots of these plaques in her brain. The brain was getting redder and oranger over time. She also showed some signs of the neurofibrillary tangles that we see. Again, you can look for these orange and red spots showing where we see that Alzheimer's pathology building up. But really interestingly, if you just look at the structure of her brain over time as she got older, you can see that there was widening of the soul side. Her brain was shrinking as she got older. And that's something we all experience. So she did have a lot of the changes we think are Alzheimer's associated, but she did not develop dementia. So how did she do this? What was so amazing about her? Well, first we learned she had a genetic signature that is actually protective for Alzheimer's disease. So not something we control, just something we get from mom and dad. But she was apolipoprotein E2/3, and having that ApoE2 is very protective. She had a very active lifestyle. She had a very rich educational background. She went to a school dedicated to children with intellectual disabilities, and she was working, so, and a really nice social network. So she essentially followed all the rules that we might suggest to lead to a healthy brain, despite having a lot of Alzheimer's disease pathology. And she managed to stay cognitively intact pretty much to the very end. And she was a pretty amazing lady. So this shows that even one person can tell us so much about a way to prevent Alzheimer's disease. So I'll punt now and just kind of end up with thinking about how can we do better in the future as a team, as a village, to improve the quality of life for people with Down syndrome as they get older. And all of these things also apply to us and families of people with Down syndrome. And that is to remain on top of the science, be aware of new science, new studies, new educational opportunities, to advocate for research in this space so that we can continue to help people with Down syndrome, and to think about and encourage for families whether or not they could participate in research. And we have lots of community partnerships that we work together to really convey this messaging, which is this. The take-home messages are healthy diets, exercise, making it fun, dancing counts. If you dance with friends, you have your social engagement. Learn new things, play games, get lots of good sleep. But most importantly, be positive and think about prevention being a most powerful approach to preventing Alzheimer's disease than trying to treat the disease once it's passed. So I'm going to thank some of my amazing volunteers who participate in research, who have taught us a lot about aging and Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And I'll leave this slide up ever so briefly while Lucy gets on to show that we have some really fun, we do have some amazing community resources that are available. And you can just, again, this slide will be shared. And we're all working together very hard to do better. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Lucy, while you get yours up, let me just, I keep getting several questions about will everybody be receiving the slide deck? So let me just say now, I know some of you came on a little later, you definitely will be getting copies of both the slide decks and a link to the recorded presentation. And if you have any questions, please enter it in the Q&A. The chat is very lengthy, difficult to run through. So please enter any questions in that, and we will get to it at the end of Lucy's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Head. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. And that will be very helpful for us as we go into part 2 of our conversation today. So I'm Lucy Ezralou, and I serve as Senior Psychologist Supervisor, Clinical Lead for the Clinical Services branch out of the Office of Statewide Clinical Services, California Department of Developmental Services. And I'm a clinical neuropsychologist by training. So just some disclosures and disclaimer as I go forward. It is my pleasure to let you know about my affiliation with DDS. My remarks today are not the official viewpoint of DDS, but rather is offered here to give you something, a tool to think about that could be useful in your daily support of individuals with Down syndrome and suspected dementia. Also want to let you know I'm a board member of the National Task Group on Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices, and I serve as co-chair of the NTG's Committee on Applied Research and Clinical Health, which we call ARCH. And the reason I'm talking to you today about the NTG EDSD is I was the person who was the lead for the National Task Group in the piloting of this instrument. So my objectives in talking to you this afternoon, and I'm so pleased to be able to do it, is to consider the use of the NTG EDSD, the National Task Group for Early Detection Screen for Dementia, as a way of capturing observations of change in adaptive skills among individuals aging with Down syndrome and with suspected dementia. And consider the use of this tool to identify and address all of those modifiable factors that Dr. Head told us about regarding aging with Down syndrome and dementia, and discuss how the team could utilize findings were they to use the rating tool to aid their decision-making on support services and services for individuals with suspected dementia. So later on, if we have time, I will actually pull up a copy of the NTG EDSD and a completed one that I've done for the purpose of the webinar, and we will refer to the person throughout this as I talk about the tool as David. So you'll be learning a little bit more about David. So I'm going to tell you what the tool is and it is not, and I'm actually going to start with what it's not. It is not a clinical tool. What do I mean by that? I mean, you would not diagnose somebody with dementia on the basis of using this tool. The actual diagnosis and evaluation of dementia is pretty complicated and comprehensive, and no screening tool is actually going to give you the information you need with regards to it. It is not a Down syndrome specific tool. In other words, it was developed to be used or utilized with individuals with a broad range of intellectual and or developmental disorders. And there's no score that you get at the end of using this tool. And individuals are not directly assessed with this tool. Rather, they are rated. So what is it now that we know what it's not? Well, it is an administrative rating tool. It allows team members to communicate and gather observations of change that may be meaningful to the eventual assessment of dementia for the individual. It is a free tool. You can download it. I'll tell you how in just a minute. And it doesn't require any license as a professional to administer it. Family members, staff members, a full range of stakeholders can administer this rating tool. So here's the kind of graphic about it. Hopefully we'll get a chance to look at it directly. It can be completed by support staff, family, others, and the purpose of it is to note the presence of key behaviors that we have come to associate with dementia. It picks up on the person's health status, their activities of daily living, their behaviors and function, memory, and even for those who may be self-reporting some problems. It's available in multiple languages, and you can get it, as I said, it's free, downloadable from the NTG website. And you see the link on the bottom, and yes, you will all get copies of the presentation. So who and where and what is involved in completing the NTG EDSD? The NTG EDSD is meant to be completed by somebody who is familiar with the individual. Again, it's an administrative and communication tool. It's not a clinical tool. So whoever has everyday knowledge of the person is the person who is in the best position to do this rating. Where can you do it? Well, you can do it anywhere where the individual is. So if the person attends a day program, it could be helpful for the staff at the day program to complete a record. If this person lives in a residence, it may be helpful for the staff to complete it. It may be helpful for family to complete it. It may be helpful for if the person has supported living services for the staff that come in and work with the individual in their home. That might be helpful to complete. And what are you doing in order to complete it? You're gathering information, and the main information you may have to pull together in order to complete it is medical and other chart material in order to fill out some of the questions that have to do with what the person's medical or mental health conditions might be, and other kinds of information like medications, etc. So the whole point of this enterprise is to capture observations of change. So the assessment of dementia actually depends upon observation. Even if we, have tests that could tell us if the person has dementia, meaning lab tests, the main thing is to find out how does this person function and how has there been a change in this person's functioning. So we have a particular challenge when it comes to individuals with Down syndrome and other types of intellectual and developmental disorders. For the typically aging population, there are tests that we can fairly reliably say will tell us about decline, change, or particularly decline from age-related behaviors, such as thinking skills, which may signal dementia. But there are very few assessments that provide a similar type of information about change that's pertinent to detection of dementia for individuals with intellectual and developmental disorders. And for those few that do exist, very little consensus about the use of those tests. So healthcare practitioners are very dependent upon the collateral information provided by you when you come to see the healthcare provider along with the individual whom you're supporting, and very dependent upon the information provided by family members. All of you who know the individual and can recognize changes from baseline functioning. So what does it mean to say that we're going to recognize changes from baseline functioning? What does baselining functioning actually mean in this context? Well, when we consider somebody's baseline, we're talking about what's typical or usual for them in terms of their memory, in terms of their thinking, their behavior, their activities of daily living. So for instance, David, whom I don't know if we're going to get a chance to look at more later on, but perhaps we will. David usually remembers staff names. He's good about follow up on his work routine. He can follow two-step instructions. He's mild-mannered and polite and is independent in his activities of daily living. Pretty high-functioning guy. And that's typical for him. But if we get to a point where David cannot learn the names of new staff people and refer to them by names of staff that have long ago left the residence or the workplace and has difficulty following through on instructions, if he is now frequently irritable and rude and needs showering, supervision in showering, toileting, or other activities of daily living, we would say he's displaying a departure or a change from his baseline. There has been a move from how we knew him to be typically and usually. So the deal is not only to identify change, but to identify change that's meaningful in terms of functioning. So not all change from baseline is going to be meaningful for our purposes. And the NTG-EDSD is organized to identify domains important recognition of those types of meaningful change that can alert caregivers about the need for follow-up and follow-through, that we are suspecting that there may be dementia that is at play here. So let's consider how we can follow up by sharing findings from the NTG-EDSD once we get them. We can bring this to the team and just make sure all members of the team know about client change from the usual functioning, and that would probably prompt further investigation. We can give our findings or share the findings about the person's change with the client's healthcare provider and share with them, because they're not going in the context of their visit with the individual, know about those changes unless that's reported to them by the team. And we can recognize that more information is needed. So we may have to identify other types of tracking or data collection tools in order to really get more information about what these changes might be about. And we can consider changes in how staff and families support the individual with suspected dementia on a daily basis. So what are we interested in tracking? We're particularly interested in tracking those adaptive behaviors that interfere with independent functioning, diminish the person's quality of life, and get in the way of the person's valued goals in terms of independent living, work, or relationships. And particularly if there are changes in behavior that may put the individual or others at risk in terms of safety issues, or may result in the person's loss of their placement. And if we have put interventions in place, we're interested in tracking the person's response to the interventions put in place. When we talk about adaptive skills, there are usually two large areas we consider. We consider activities of daily living, ADLs, and we consider instrumental activities of daily living, IADLs. So you might observe in terms of changes of activities of daily living, the person becomes incontinent, they may develop balance and gait problems, they begin to have problems with self-dressing, self-feeding, even speaking. There is generally a decrease in independence and increase in dependence upon assistance for bathing, grooming, and personal care. For instrumental activities of daily living, these are the more complex activities that support our independent living in the community. For instance, if the person previously had the skill to handle money, if they previously did, they may begin showing difficulty handling money. They may begin showing difficulty maintaining their own living space, or if they previously had shopped or cleaned, they may have difficulty managing those activities. If they were proficient in the use of a phone or other electronic devices, they may begin to show or evidence signs of change there. What changes in behavior might we observe? Well, there might be an increase in the person's impulsivity. They may begin hoarding. They may become verbally or physically aggressive. They may show an increased reactivity to other people. Social behavior that they exhibit may not match the social situation. And again, these would represent changes, presuming the person previously did not show these behaviors. They may show increased restlessness and agitation. They may begin wandering in the middle of the night, or evidence increased sleep problems. And Dr. Head spoke about that, right? And the value and importance of that. What about emotional or psychological changes? What might we observe about that? Well, we may see changes with an increased evidence of anxiety or depression, increased irritability or annoyance on the part of the individual, evidence of increased suspiciousness, or evidence of increased fear. These are among some of the more commonly reported emotional or psychological changes that we hear about. What changes might we observe in cognition? In other words, the person's thinking ability. We may find out that they have memory changes that interfere with their productivity at work, or their inability. It may result in their inability to follow through on chores at home. They may have difficulty maintaining focused attention and become much more highly distractible than they had been previously. They may have difficulty learning new information, which is going to impact upon their ability to adapt to change as changing situations might demand. They may begin to show problems with everyday problem solving, and language skills may become impoverished. These are all items that you can track within the NTG EDSD, and are the kinds of things you might observe, and you want to, have the opportunity to share observations about it. So the NTG EDSD, the tool uses a Likert rating scale, and I think most of you are aware of Likert rating scales. You've used them in one or another situation. And what it is going to ask you to do is indicate from a range of always, in the case, always, but somewhat worse, new, like new symptom, or does not apply. So those are 4 categories. You're going to be rating the individual on a number of domains. So again, always been the case, has always been the case, but is worse, is a new symptom, or does not apply. So let's consider what each of these tell us as a way of capturing observations of change. So you'll see that in pages 3 and 4 of the NTG-EDSD. What do we mean by always been the case? So let's say David has always needed help bathing. Let's say it's always been the case that he does not initiate conversations. He'll respond to conversations initiated by others, but he himself will not initiate them. And that he has always slept excessive amounts. If you've chosen the rating, always been the case, you're actually indicating there hasn't been any change. The person is really, in your observation, behaving in the way that they have always characteristically and typically behaved. If you on pages 3 and 4 choose the rating always the case but worse, well, what does that mean? It means, for instance, if David has previously needed verbal prompts to complete showering, and now he needs hand-over-hand assistance to complete showering or another activity of daily living, that is something that is worse than had been. If David has always had mobility problems, let's say he used a walker, but now he needs a wheelchair for anything further than a short distance, that means it's always been the case, but it's worse. If he previously needed his food cut for him, but now he can only eat finger food, that's a change in the direction of this is an area that's always been a problem, but now it's worse. So you're indicating the person has lost more skills, is less independent in activities of daily living in an area in which they've already had a problem. So the situation has gotten a bit worse for them. That is one indication of change. Another indication of change is a new symptom. What do we mean when we say we choose new symptom? Well, David has episodes of incontinence, which began 5 months ago. David has become lost while walking home from his program twice within the past 6 months. He cannot remember the name of his new staff and began calling the new staff by the name of a worker who's not been at the home for several years. By choosing new symptom, you're indicating that this was not a problem that you would previously observe, for instance, when David was last assessed, but within the last year, it's been a problem, and it's possibly a sign of change in functioning. The last in the Likert categories on pages 3 and 4 is does not apply. So what do we mean by choosing the rating does not apply? So David does not need assistance in showering. David does not need assistance in dressing. David does not sleep excessively. I know I previously said he did, but for the purpose of the example, what I mean here is it doesn't apply. He doesn't have a problem in these areas. So if you choose does not apply for the person you're rating, it means that the individual doesn't really have an issue here. There's been no change. So what do you do with the information once you get information from this use of this rating scale? Well, you're going to share it with the findings with the members of the interdisciplinary team. And if you've had the scale filled out across several settings, let's say the person goes to a day program as well as in a residence or the family filled out something, there may be discrepancies across settings. And the team is going to look to see how they can reconcile those discrepancies. Why would they observe some changes in some settings and not in others? You may need to request additional information. You're going to begin brainstorming possible approaches. Do we need to find out more? Do we have to make some changes? You're going to operationalize the plan of action. And in your discussion, once you've kind of reviewed some of these things, you may decide, it's time to refer the person to the healthcare provider or another professional do a more extensive workup and kind of move the ball down the court in terms of getting this person looked at. And of course, you want to evaluate the effectiveness of any plan you have been previously put in place. So you utilize the findings within the EDSD to look for patterns. What are areas in which change has been noted? What is the extent of the change? Is something being done to currently address identified issues? And it's a way of advancing important conversations. You're going to raise neurocognitive disorder, meaning dementias, or competing problems for exploration as possible explanations for the changes you've observed. In addition to dementia, there are other possible things that can contribute to change that might not actually have to do with dementia. Person may be suffering from an untreated or unrecognized depression. They may have delirium secondary to some medical issue. They may have some sensory changes. They may have the experience of unaddressed pain. And there may be multiple psychosocial stressors that are at play here. And, you know, I really appreciated what Dr. Head did in kind of raising up, lifting up all the possible risk factors that we can begin to observe and perhaps begin to intervene. So we might address modifiable risk factors if we discover the person has untreated mental health disorder or chronic medical problems that have not been well managed, or sensory issues that need to be connected or need to be coached on some stress management techniques, or have been socially isolated and need some way to remain connected to important others, or are sitting around and lacking meaningful activity because they're no longer going to a day program or working or, you know, meaningfully engaged in activity. So what kinds of decisions may follow from the use of the NTG EDSD? Well, the team might say, you know what we have to do certain modifications to the environment of the person's residence in order to have greater access so the person may be able to use it better. We may decide that where the person is living is not going to offer them sufficient support, so it might be a change in residence. Or we may be looking at staffing support. Maybe they need a different staffing arrangement, or a change in program, or something added to their positive daily routine, or just generally their activities. And what other areas might the EDSD point the team in the direction of pursuing? Well, again, might be that we're going to follow up on those mental health or behavioral health supports, or that we're going to see about hearing aids, or see about glasses, prescriptions that may have changed. Maybe the individual with Down syndrome now has depth perception problems that need to be addressed. And of course, to identify those chronic health problems, as Dr. had mentioned, the role of sleep apnea, diabetes, and thyroid issues in terms of the overall health and how they may pose as modifiable risk factors for individuals with Down syndrome and suspected dementia. So considerations for the use of the NTG EDSD. So again, I know I am saying this ad nauseum, but I'm going to say it again. This tool is not for the diagnosis of dementia. For that, the person needs a comprehensive workup. This is an administrative tool for communication within the team and with the healthcare provider. So the diagnosis of a neurocognitive disorder, and that is the term that's used for dementias, involve medical exam and direct cognitive and adaptive testing of the individual in question. You can't rate somebody and then decide they have dementia. They have to be actually directly assessed. If an individual is already known to have dementia, you can still use this rating form to baseline observation of change, but you do not need to continue using it if the person has been formally diagnosed with a neurocognitive disorder, with a dementia. And by the way, individuals may have Alzheimer's disease, they may have other types of neurocognitive disorder like multi-infarct dementia, Lewy bodies, and they may have mixed dementias. How might the EDSC lead to a diagnosis of a neurocognitive disorder? By ruling out other factors, the healthcare provider may recommend further testing and evaluation. Findings from further evaluation may then confirm the likelihood of dementia and cover other treatable conditions. Let's turn for a minute. I think we have just a minute or so that we're going to be able to pull up David tool, if I can, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? Hold on, let me try it again. And that's it. I think now that should do it. Okay. So this is a hypothetical case. This is the cover page to the NTG EDSD. It'll tell you that, we recommend that you begin using it by age 40. In some places they're using it at an earlier age. And you'll see they ask some questions. And by the way, there is a newer version of this, which then eliminates the IQ scores. There is, if you go on the site now, the NTG site now, and you download a copy, you can either do it as a PDF or an electronic fillable form, which is what I have here. From May 2024, we do not include the IQ in this box. And you'll notice I use it as a worksheet. Yellow for changes noted and green for not area of significant change, either a lifelong condition. So for instance, we know that David has Down syndrome, is considered Down syndrome and has Down syndrome and intellectual disability. Okay. And that is not changed. However, there are a number of areas where things are somewhat worse. He's previously been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment in 2016. That's some psychosocial stressors, the death of someone close, changes in staff that were close to him. And you'll see what I was talking about in 3 and 4, pages 3 and 4, where you're asked in a Likert scale type way about always been the case, always but worse, new symptom, or does not apply. And I can see where we are with time. So I am actually going to encourage you to go on the NTG site and to download and to utilize this. And if you have any questions about this, I would be pleased to help you with that.
Thank you so much, Lucy. So just a quick little comment before we get on. There's only a couple questions because Dr. Head has been answering them, which is awesome. About the ETSD, I think one of the things that also wasn't really touched on was that there is this turnover with support staff that we know of. And so to have that valuable information with a new support staff on what someone was already able to do is really important, I feel like. So just a really good bit of information. And I know a parent, Amy, mentioned that it would be amazing if people used it at annual IPPs, families could complete it, day programs could complete it, residential staff, and then compare and kind of uniform the services around that for the next year. So it's really, it's a tool for a whole lot of things. Yeah. So,
Will find helpful for it. It is a communication tool and an administrative tool for the team. Yeah.
absolutely. We have a question here that asks, Christina is asking, have there been changes noticed in communication, specifically methods such as responding more to ASL than verbal, given that the person knows ASL?
I think you're looking at me.
I'm looking at both of you.
Yeah, I'm hoping Lucy might have an answer. I
Yeah.
honestly have not heard of such a thing, but I can ask our team about that in a follow-up with email. It sounds pretty amazing to
Well,
go back to a different form of communication if that's an early sign of a cognitive change.
yeah,
Mm.
it also is a visual in some ways. If you can't quite find that word that comes out, maybe that is more of a thing that we learned way back, right? That memory. And so maybe that's coming out.
Yeah, because I think, there's that adage that what you learn first is what you keep to the very
Correct.
end. And that could be if they when they were a little baby, they did the sign language and returned to that.
Right.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
That is
very,
interesting. I don't know anything more about it, but that is a fascinating
Mhm.
possibility.
very much. I think really that is the only other question. I'm just running through the chats real quick because there's some people that put questions there and I just didn't want to miss anything. Okay, well, here's a scenario. She was agreeing with Amy in terms of it being very useful to help service providers. She has a client with Down syndrome and early onset Alzheimer's disease who wants to be as independent as possible and whose family supports her in that. At her program, she's allowed to walk next door to the convenience store by herself, which they say is fine with them for now. But at what point do we say that's no longer safe before it becomes a situation where she can't remember how to get back to the program next door? It's really challenging because we want to help her to stay independent and what she can do while she can still do those things.
Well, so one of the things is I think it is hard to anticipate in advance how those changes will happen. And sometimes what people do will be to partner with a program next door or whatever, wherever they're going, like a store or whatever. And so people there can kind of help with wayfinding issues, and there can be a connection. And, again, you're supporting the person perhaps behind the scenes while really just enabling them to do or facilitating them remaining as independent as possible. And it's always the issue is safety. At what point does it become unsafe? And then communities will probably want to look to see if you have local project fines that, the project find that will, at the local police department that actually will register somebody who is walking in the community or could be in the community. And if somebody gets lost, it then will become a lot easier to kind of find them and get them back. That's a really big problem for people who live in the community and are wanderers. Yeah. And yeah.
It's essentially the golden alerts that we get by text sometimes. This applies to everybody. When should somebody stop driving? When should somebody not go
Right.
unescorted? And I guess it's a one-by-one case basis, but I love your idea, Lucy. Keep that support in the background and until, so something bad doesn't happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question in the chat. A client of mine has Down syndrome and is deaf and cannot speak as well. She has recently been showing mood fluctuations and cries abruptly. What is the best way to know what's going on? Mm.
I would say, first of all, a good medical evaluation is in order because there could be something like a UTI that's causing distress and pain and they can't verbalize it. So that would be a starting point and me being a non-MD would suggest.
I think that's a perfect place to begin. And then also look if there are any kind of new psychosocial stressors in the person's life situation. Has there been somebody important who is no longer there? Or is there any change in the person's support network or supports that might indicate an increase in sadness or
Right.
loss, feeling of loss?
Right. One question, and I'm not quite sure how to answer this or if this is the right spot, but are there any tools that we can use to support parents for early start with kids with Down syndrome?
Oh, that's, I was kind of hoping that graphic that you'll get when the slides are shared.
Mhm.
Those are really wonderful things to share with families. They're very actionable. And I know there's amazing programs and the Down Syndrome Association, the Gigi's Playhouse, that have all these amazing programs for little ones.
Mhm.
And they're all going to have a benefit in the long run. So yeah, that's a great idea.
It's a great idea. And then with early start, I mean, the whole thing is about early intervention, right? And so that is, again, for families to just make sure that their kiddos are evaluated. So you don't have to have any particular diagnosis to, as long as you have a 25% kind of delay in an area, one area, you know. And so I would say go for it, you know.
Ooh, okay, one more. My client has Down syndrome and has dementia. He needs more support, but does not want to move to a residence for more support. What can we do?
I don't know, Lucy, I can, again, these situations apply to everybody.
Right.
It's not unique to people with Down syndrome. So maybe there's some wonderful tools out there to help with that transition.
Yeah, or, that there might be some kind of, to look to see what can be brought into the person's existing situation that might be supportive to them. And that whole idea, see, transitions are going to be scarier and more difficult if you have dementia. You have less resources with which to make the transition. And to just kind of find as supportive a way, so the family needs help with that in terms of how to best, I mean, obviously they're concerned about this and they want this to happen, but it's very hard to force somebody into a situation, but you want to get it before a crisis occurs and then they may lose their placement, right? So I can't think of any one tool. It's a process really that the family needs to engage in with the individual.
Yeah, for sure. And I would add to that that I feel like it needs to be thought about what residence that's going to be for future as well. So as that, if he truly has dementia or signs of Alzheimer's, to really be able to stay in that place versus having another transition maybe a year later as well, right? So kind of looking ahead also when you're looking for that residence, right?
Fewer transitions, the better.
Yeah,
I
for sure.
don't think there's any right or wrong right way to do this. And another, I think, great source of information is friends and families of other families that have gone through this process. And I know there's some great places to share, and the support groups are also a great place to ask some of those questions.
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree. Okay, and then one quick question, and then we'll let everyone go. Um, the NTG screening tool, I'm reading that it's being used yearly by Affordable Care Act's annual wellness visit. Can this tool be used more often than once a year to consider it a valid score?
Well, first of all, there's no score that comes from it. And it is meant to be a decision-making tool for the team, an administrative tool. So I'm glad that they're using it in the Affordable Care Act, the wellness visit, where it's being used. But you can use, I would say, every 6 to 8 months in some cases, or when the team begins to observe changes. So let's say the person was evaluated last March, but you have begun to observe changes before then. I would use it because it's not as though there's any time factor with this. This is all about communication within the team that is supporting the individual,
Mhm.
And
Okay,
people change at different rates. They progress in different rates,
great.
the convention.
And all these questions are popping through. Um, quickly, is there, could you speak just to the NTG trainings? Because the question is here is the biggest obstacle for us is not funding hours for SLS, but finding the staff who has the skill set for people with dementia. Could we talk a little bit just briefly about NTG's training for staff, or should I
Well,
just?
you know, so what I recommend is you go on the website. There are trainings that dementia care. It is dementia care curriculum. Alzheimer's Association also offers something for dementia care, where you learn the fundamentals of that as well. Of course, the NTG one is going to be more specific for individuals with intellectual and developmental disorders. And it does cost something that, you know, and they will organize, you know, I believe that they will deliver it to an agency if an agency wants to make an arrangement with the NTG for the trainers to deliver that training.
And also TIPA Snow is another great resource to go on website and look at some of the webinars she offers, but also just YouTube videos.
And I think that the National Association of Direct Service Support Professionals also does dementia training.
Perfect. So hopefully that helps. All right. Well, thank you so much, both Dr. Head and Dr. Israel. It was wonderful. Lots of great information and so much to soak in. We're getting some hand claps and applauses and hearts. So thank you everyone for coming and taking the time to attend. We really appreciate it. I'll be sending out the slideshow and the link to the recording in the next few days. So look for that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you, Lucy and Marianne.
Take care.